Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Unkillable, works that almost never fail in performance, even if the performance really sucks. And this is one of those works. This is really one of those works because I've seen performances that really sucked. Terrible performances, but the audience is still blown away. It's not the same thing on recordings, of course, because you can make comparisons and you can talk about the performances that really suck. So I want to talk about the work and some performances that really sucked, and then why it works anyway. I'll tell you why it works anyway. First, the work. Mahler's Ninth Symphony. And a bunch of you mentioned this right away when I announced this series. It's kind of an interesting choice, isn't it? Because first of all, it's terribly long. It's like an hour and 20 minutes long. It's extremely complex. It has endless ways where performances can screw up, and most of them do screw up in one or more of those ways, astonishingly. But at the end of the day, it hardly matters. And the reason it hardly matters is because of that last movement, the Adagio, the most potent, moving, expressive, intense, extraordinary musical depiction of the serene ebbing away of life, a serene death. It is so unmistakable what's going on in that music. It's so poignant. It's the last thing that you remember of the work. So all the crap that comes before, the previous hour that may or may not have gone well, the climax of the first movement that may or may not have had its appropriate tam-tam smash, whether the second movement dances, those dorky waltzes, are sufficiently differentiated, the rondo burlesca, which is that gnarly, nasty counterpoint, is it mean enough? Is it nasty enough? Doesn't matter. Almost doesn't matter anyway, unless you're like a music critic or somebody with no sense of feeling. I mean, that finale is really the part of the symphony that's just about unkillable. It always works. It really does, no matter what. So let's talk about some of my own experiences of the work, and you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. First, a performance that really taught me that it's going to work no matter what happens. Actually, it was a fabulous performance. It was the Israel Philharmonic, conducted by Leonard Bernstein at Carnegie Hall. And I brought my sister Jody, who is not a classical music person by any stretch of the imagination, but she likes it. We went out together to concerts. She was always a good sport. A wonderful sport. I mean, I took her to see Janacek's Yennefer, in the middle of a terrible thunderstorm. She was playing field hockey moments before. It almost got struck by lightning when I scooped her up and we got on the train or drove into New York. I think we took the train and we went to see Yennefer. She saw Dialogues of the Carmelites with me. I mean, we saw Tchaikovsky's Peak Dame, and she was a student of Russian literature and Russian language. So, I mean, that was really a fun thing for her to see. So, yeah, I mean, we saw weird stuff. I could bring her to see the things that I couldn't get my other friends to go watch with me as often as not. But I brought her to Carnegie Hall to see this Mahler Ninth with Bernstein and the Israel Phil, and it was a beautiful performance. It really was. I mean, the end of the rondo burlesque, Bernstein was in his big hold up on those two, dum, bum, and then going faster and faster and faster and faster. When it was over, she looked at me and she just said, "Whoa, that was exciting." And it really was. But that slow movement, I was afraid of the slow movement. I was afraid to take her because it's a Bernstein in this late period. It was going to be really, really slow, 25 plus minutes, agonizingly slow at the end. And she was absolutely mesmerized, totally mesmerized. It had her completely entranced. And she said to me afterwards, she said, "That was so sad, so beautifully sad." And yes, it is. And, that was the performance that really convinced me that Mahler 9 is safely unkillable, or pretty much unkillable, to be honest. And I saw a couple of Wretched performances, which also drove that home to me. Wretched performance number 1. The Berlin Philharmonic and Claudio Abbado. He was in his ultimate micromanaging mode. He spent the entire performance looking at the second violins, and he had them arranged, antiphonally. And he's sitting there conducting the second. Nobody else even got a glance. It was a completely ordinary performance. Nobody seemed inspired. Nobody seemed interested. He was staring at the second violins. It's a second violin symphony. It's very interesting. The opening of the first movement is for the second violins. The tune is in the second violins. The opening of the second movement is for the second violins. It gives the second violins a lot to do, thematically speaking. But, there are other people there too. And violas. I mean, he looked at the violas once in a while. I don't know what the hell he was doing up there, but the rest of the orchestra just played it as if they were on autopilot. And until we got to the finale, they were still on autopilot. It didn't change. I mean, it was a dreadful performance, but that slow movement, it grabbed the audience nonetheless. And audiences in these days, I mean, they're going to give everything a standing ovation anyway, right? I mean, no matter what it is, if it's live, and that's fine because they're having a good time and it's the Berlin Phil. I mean, how bad could it be, right? This was, by the way, that same series of performances that had that Mahler fifth where the trumpet cracked the opening, blew it entirely, and the whole performance was totally demoralized. But we should have a little sympathy for an audience on a tour like that, because by the time they get to New York, they're usually exhausted. And they've been playing Mahler symphonies all the time. I mean, it's not fair. It's not nice. And it was a lousy Mahler ninth, but it didn't matter. The audience was happy. Those last pages always make their effect. I mean, he didn't need a conductor at all, frankly. He could have just gone home. It still would have worked just as well. In fact, the fact that he was there probably hindered rather than helped the performance. So it was also with Bernard Haitink and the Boston Symphony. I have never seen a performance where an orchestra cared less about what the conductor was doing. It was extraordinary. I don't know if he pissed him off, which is quite possible. He could be a very sullen conductor in places. He looked miserable. I mean, he looked miserable the whole performance. Even when it was over, he had this sourpuss expression on his face. It was just terrible. And the orchestra played the piece as though they were simply playing it from memory, because whatever he was doing, they weren't paying attention. It wasn't a bad performance. I mean, there weren't like horrifying mistakes and things like that. They just weren't ever on the same page. And you could tell there was this disconnect between this stuff happening on the podium and what you heard the orchestra doing. It really was kind of fascinating to me. They obviously hadn't gotten along. And he had a good relationship with Boston. Remember, he made a bunch of recordings with the Boston Symphony, most of them dreadful, particularly his Ravel remakes, which were just awful. But he just had one of those days. It happens. It happens. But it was Mahler 9. And because it was Mahler 9, we had that extraordinary slow movement at the end and those gorgeous closing pages where, maybe they paid a little attention to him. I don't know. Whatever happened, it did its thing. It worked its magic. It's a piece that casts a spell. And it casts that spell from the very beginning. I know I talk only about the finale, but the opening movement too. It begins with that faltering heartbeat pulse and those motives, dum, bum, 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 first in the harp and then transferred to the timpani where they sound terrifying. Dum, 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 dum. Mahler knew what he was doing, and he knew how to transform simple ideas in ways that make them sound everything from ethereal to absolutely horrifying. And it's the same thing, exactly the same thing. It's all a question of timbre and sound. And nobody really had a sense of orchestral timbre to equal Mahler's. He was amazing that way. And so the ninth is one of those works. You just can't kill it. Try as they might. Try as they have done. They have tried to kill it. I've seen it, efforts to snuff it out utterly, but the music fights back and emerges triumphantly. It's one of the greatest examples of my contention that the classics are hardy as weeds. You just can't keep them down. And Mahler ninth, no, you can't keep it down. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.